I was listening to it talked about for at least 10 years before it happened. And the neighbors would get together and talk about this Conklinville Dam that was going to be built. And most people said, it'll never be built.
Nestled in the southern foothills of the majestic Adirondack Park in upstate New York is the Great Sacandaga Lake. With 42 square miles of water surface and 125 miles of shoreline spanning 3 counties, this body of water is the largest reservoir in the state. Completed in 1930, it has the capacity to hold back nearly 38 billion cubic feet of water, and at 29 miles in length, it's comparable to nearby Lake George. The lake is managed by the Hudson River Black River Regulating District, a public benefit corporation of New York State. For thousands of years, these lands were favored fishing and hunting grounds for many Native Americans, including the Mohegan and the Mohawk, among other tribes. The southern portion of the valley was a swampy area where many creeks fed into the Sacandaga River, making it an area abundant with wildlife. This location led to the establishment of trade routes between tribes of the Mohawk Valley and those of the Lake Champlain region. Sir William Johnson, the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the British Crown, was the single largest landholder in the Mohawk Valley, and his holdings extended to the southern portion of the Sacandaga Valley, known as the Great Vlaie. Both the French and Indian War and the American Revolution exposed soldiers to the rich natural resources of the valley. After hostilities subsided, land patents previously issued by the British government were surveyed, and the patentees began selling tracts of land to early European settlers migrating west. Throughout the 1800s, the Sacandaga Valley became home to a number of bustling settlements. Long before the reservoir was created, people had acquired property and settled down. They carved out a living and raised their families. They built communities and helped their neighbors. They called it home.
The hamlet of Conklinville was founded by Gurdon Conklin about 1848. He went there to build a tannery known as the Linwood Tannery. The other major industry in town was the Conklinville Woodenware Factory, owned for many years by Ben Jenkins. It was the largest employer in the town of day in the late 1800s and produced wooden buckets and washboards and clothespins, among other items. Since the hamlet was located on both sides of the Sacandaga River, a 3-span iron truss bridge was built in the second half of the 19th century to connect the two areas. Conklinville was a bustling little town with numerous churches and hotels and smaller business, and a very popular store, Palmer's Store, where locals would meet to pick up their mail, buy supplies, and tell stories by the wood stove. Day Center, also known as Day Corners, was located in the middle of the town, about halfway between the Edinburgh town line and Conklinville. It was the home of the Dutch Reformed Church, more commonly known as the Old Stone Church, a masonry building built in 1844 out of locally cut stone. Schoolhouse, general store, and hotel were also located near the main intersection. Logging and collecting hemlock bark for the large tanneries were the main industrial pursuits in this quiet community. Small iron truss bridge known as the Day Center Bridge brought people back and forth across the river. Day Center was also the location of Henry Paul's gristmill and sawmill, an early water-powered mill that was located on the Paul River just north of Day Center.
The general demeanor of the community of Hutsville was a typical small rural community. The road went through from Hadley to Northville, and it was a daily stage that came and went, usually stopping at my grandfather and grandmother's store. In some cases, the mail would have been brought by the stage. There were a hotel there, a church, several small woodworking facilities. It was a community where everybody knew everybody. The kids all played ball out in the back lot. Very, very small, virtually no sidewalks, dirt roads. Everybody had horses and cows and chickens and pigs. It was a lively place, but it was typical of the valley communities.
Beecher Hollow was the first hamlet settled in Edinburgh on the west bank of the Sacandaga River in the 1790s. By the 1870s, businesses and the community were booming. There were 2 churches, 2 stores, a post office, a school, blacksmiths, a gristmill, and a tannery. There were also shops that produced carriages, cabinets, coffins, and furniture, plus 2 machine shops. One of the biggest businesses was Charlie Sumner's sawmill and hay rake factory. Handheld rakes were shipped all over the world. Eli Beecher was one of the earliest settlers, and his house, once a post office and stagecoach stop, still stands to this day. Arid Copeland was another early settler who left his mark on this hamlet. The covered bridge, which bears his name, is a popular historic site for visitors. He built the bridge to allow his cattle to cross Beecher Creek en route to pasture. Bachelorville, on the east side of the river, had almost 3 times the population of Beecher Hollow. It had 3 large woodenware mills, all built by the Bachelor family. The first mill, eventually becoming owned by Lucien de Gollier and Son, manufactured washboards. The second mill became known as King and Snow and Company, manufacturing all types of wooden pails and tubs. The third Bachelor mill, known as Bachelor and Jenkins, produced barrels, barrel covers, clothespins, and bowls. Products from all 3 mills were shipped all over the United States. Bachelorville had 2 churches, a post office, a 2-story school, a hotel and tavern, a blacksmith shop, and 3 stores.
The hamlet of Fish House, located on the eastern edge of the town of Northampton, was a popular destination for fishermen and hunters. By 1805, Fish House had grown enough to be able to support 2 hotels as well as general stores. It was a thriving area for farming due to the river valley. Just down the road from the Fish House Hotel stood the beautiful Sinclair brick house built in 1809. This stately homestead belonged to the wealthy Sinclair family, whose prized Jersey cows were famous among the local farmers. The village center of Fish House was surrounded on all sides by beautiful farmhouses and general stores and rambling country roads. Fish House had not 1 but 2 covered bridges, and the smaller of the 2 bridges was a 1-lane bridge that crossed over Fly Creek. The larger bridge, known as the Fish House Covered Bridge, was built by Daniel Stewart in 1818 and was a 2-lane covered bridge, and it spanned 400 feet. This bridge was the most well-known and loved bridges of the Sacandaga Valley.
Benedict was a small hamlet 2 miles northeast of Broadavon, consisting of about 24 families. The 1905 Atlas of Fulton County shows the main industry in Benedict was a glove shop, which employed many local women, like many other Sacandaga hamlets. The residents had their own store, post office, school, which sat right next to the Benedict Church and parsonage. This flat, sandy ground made it a perfect location for a horse racing track called the Red Top Park. Horse races drew crowds from the local community and were among the most popular events in Benedict.
My name is Peter Vandenberg. I come from a long line of Vandenbergs. They moved into the area today known as Munsonville in the late 1700s. Near the eastern border of the town of Mayfield, the small farming community of Munsonville was located in the area known as the Fly. This area had its own school, and it had a general store for necessities. But many residents visited the nearby village of Broadavon, where a larger variety of goods could be found. For generations after generation, the same families would work this land. Farmers raised crops to feed their families and used the surplus to barter for other items they needed. Dirt roads meandered through the trees, leading from one farmhouse to another in this quiet valley community.
Cranberry Creek was founded in the early 1800s. Ideally located between the villages Mayfield and Northville, when the FJ&G Railroad decided to build a line to Northville, the little hamlet was a natural choice for a train station. Myron Gilbert was the first Cranberry Creek station master and was known as a friend to everyone. This quaint little community had its own school, church, and post office. My great-grandfather's farm was there before the lake went in, and it was a big farm, and it took care of a lot of families that would feed, so it was very interesting, and people were very friendly and neighborly, and everybody knew everybody.
Osborne Bridge was located along the western shore of the Sacandaga River in the town of Northampton. Early in the 1800s, the area was referred to as Denton's Corners, but when Calvin Osborne built the covered bridge and gifted it to the community, it cemented him as the namesake of the hamlet. The bridge itself was a single-lane covered bridge built of wood for a population of about 150 people. The Langer family had a picturesque farm in this community where they grew crops, tended to the livestock, and raised a family. Just west of the bridge was the main intersection where the Methodist Church sat, along with the Osborne Bridge Schoolhouse, post office, and general store run by George Wilbur. Slightly north of the village of Northville, tucked along the eastern shore of the Sacandaga River, was a tiny hamlet of Parkville. Parkville had a tannery and several mills powered by the water of the Sacandaga River. It was also home to a school and the Fish Rock Hotel. Only 2 roads ran through this community situated along the main road from Wells to Northville. Residents of Parkville traveled a short distance up Lamb Hill into the village of Northville to go to church, visit the post office, and eventually attend high school.
The area known as Sacandaga Park began as a Methodist meeting camp in the mid-1800s when the FJ&G Railroad acquired the local short line in 1881. The property was soon adorned with a number of beautiful lodges. But after a destructive fire in 1898, the FJ&G Railroad decided to rebuild the park and embark upon an enormous expansion.
And then the railroad company realized that in other places after the war, there were parks being made. And they said, ho ho, why don't we just capitalize on this and make ourselves a park? And so they did. And they had Midway, they had everything in Midway oh, the most beautiful carousel, and donkeys, and there was a bowling alley, and a house of fun, and shooting galleries, and a beautiful roller skating rink. I never saw a more beautiful rink anywhere, and I've roller skated in quite a lot of places.
Visitors of Sacandaga Park could enjoy exciting spectator events on Sport Island. It was accessible by a footbridge. Or you can take the miniature train. One of the most fondly remembered attractions of the park was the rustic theater, where big-name acts appeared, like Harry Houdini, W.C. Fields, J.P. Sousa, Al Jolson, and Eddie Cantor. Anyone who grew up in the vicinity of the Sacandaga Park can share wonderful memories of life in that time, stories that have been handed down through the generations.
In those early days, that was, like the Coney Island of the North, because people came from miles and miles on trains and buses and everything to get to the Sacandaga Park. So it was a very popular spot. And my mother used to get on the train in Mayfield, and for 25 cents she could ride up to the park. And of course they went there every chance they got.
Life in the valley had been well developed throughout the 19th century, although many environmental factors became a concern with the establishment of the Industrial Revolution. As early as the 1860s, the New York State Legislature began hearing concerns for the establishment of water storage for the upper Hudson River to aid in navigation of the canals during times of drought.
Right after the Civil War in 1867, it became apparent to most everyone in the lower Hudson Valley that something needed to be done in terms of regulating the flow of the Hudson River. There were several disastrous floods that had taken place. At that time, no mention was made of the Sacandaga Reservoir or the Sacandaga Basin. That came along about 30 years later.
In 1895, the state engineer of New York pushed for building a dam at Conklinville of only 20 feet in height, but it was denied.
At that time, they were interested in regulating the flow of the Hudson River, and because the Sacandaga was the largest tributary of the Hudson River, and also the basin lent itself to being dammed up and a pond being formed because it was flat and reasonably open, they thought that that was an ideal place to do that.
1898 saw the formation of the Hudson River Water Power Company.
They knew that the Conklinville area was an excellent place to dam up the Sacandaga, to impound water in the spring, and then release it as the summer went along.
After a severe flood in 1902, New York State appointed a Water Storage Commission. They recommended using private industries to pay for the cost of creating a reservoir in exchange for a guaranteed water supply. In order to legally accomplish this, the state passed the Rivers Improvement Act, which allowed a public and private partnership in developing water resources. In 1908, the Water Supply Commission recommended to the New York State Legislature the creation of a reservoir in the Sacandaga Valley for flood control and hydropower development, but the recommendation was denied. Just 5 years later, in 1913, the most disastrous flood in the river's history caused millions of dollars in damage along the Hudson River below the Sacandaga. As a result, in 1916, the Glens Falls Chamber of Commerce petitioned the New York State Legislature to create an Upper Hudson River Regulating District. This petition was also denied. It would take another 9 years and even more flooding for a subsequent petition to finally be granted. In 1922, the city of Glens Falls and others petitioned the state for the creation of the Hudson River Regulating District. Before approving the petition, the recently created Water Control Commission was required to conduct 2 public hearings, both held in Albany, for the public to voice their concerns.
For the people coming from the Sacandaga Valley to the public hearings, it would have been close to a half a day in travel just to get to Albany. Plus, they were held in the middle of the summer, which is the busiest time of year for many farmers and other people in agricultural pursuits.
Okay, at the public hearing, there was very little representation from this area.
In reading the minutes of the public hearing, they do talk about the testimony of some of the people from the valley, one of which is Frank Sinclair. And when the district asks for what his objection is, he simply states, "I'll tell you what my objection is when you tell me what the exact project is. I don't really know what I'm objecting to until I know what you're going to do." So you can see that the people who are living here weren't really sure what the creation of the district meant for them in particular.
If you look at the public hearing text, they really didn't put up much of a fight.
The hearings that were held in 1922 were only for the creation of the Hudson River Regulating District. Once the district was created, they would have the power to create whatever reservoirs they saw necessary in river regulation. This wasn't in particular for the Sacandaga Reservoir. Though people knew that was a possibility, it wasn't specifically for the Sacandaga Reservoir. There were some formal complaints filed, such as the Village of Northville, who was against it, and also the FJ&G. But other than that, some of the people from the valley were just filing verbal objections.
The records indicate that there was no real opposition to this project, so they considered that the green light, and it was done.
After the conclusion of the public hearing, the Hudson River Regulating District was created on August 2, 1922. Just 2 years later, the district board adopted a plan for the construction of a dam at Conklinville, and Edward H. Sargent was named as the chief project engineer.
Edward Sargent served under General John Pershing during World War I in a very important role in the war in Europe.
And he came home from the war having the technology to build dams.
1 year later, in 1925, the Hudson River Regulating District adopted a plan for the construction costs of the Conklinville Dam project, where approximately 95% of the cost would be paid for by private industries benefiting from a guaranteed water supply. The other 5% would be paid for by 5 downstream communities who would benefit from flood control. The entire Sacandaga region, from Northville to Conklinville, had to be surveyed. This was no small task, especially since the surveyors and engineers had to estimate how much property would be affected by flooding once the dam was in place. The goal was to flood the Sacandaga Basin to an elevation of 771 feet above sea level, creating a body of water that would cover a little over 35 square miles. The regulating district also acquired 10 additional square miles of land at an average elevation of 778 feet above sea level to provide a comfortable zone of control. Though the local opposition present at the public hearings was not able to stop the project, there was one opponent that was able to challenge the district's proposal of creating the Sacandaga Reservoir.
The Fonda, Johnstown, and Gloversville Railroad sued the district, and first they sued the district over whether or not a district and whether or not a lake or a reservoir should be created, and that suit was not settled until 1927. Very little was accomplished, except some background information was being gathered, and all the properties that had to be purchased and where exactly 778 would fall, which was going to be the taking line or the property line that was going to be created by the district. That work was underway for the 5 years, but no contracts could be let for construction of any roads or dams or that type of thing.
My perception from the research that I've done, the document that I looked at, is that the railroad already back in the 1950, 1920 time frame decided that this was a done deal and that they would be better off collecting damages down the road and plan for that than try to stop it.
The lawsuit was finally settled in 1926, with a court finding in favor of the Hudson River Regulating District. Though the FJ&G lost their case, they were awarded a handsome settlement of $1.75 million for the loss of 7 miles of track near Cranberry Creek and a substantial section of Sacandaga Park.
It was what you would call a very peaceful valley of contented farmers, people that had lived here 1 and 2 generations. And I could understand, to them it was tragic to have to move out of their homes. And they'd been used to a way of life that they could never have again, no matter where they went.
There was little understanding of people who lived here that it made sense that they should be flooded out so that people downriver would not be flooded out. It was very hard to explain the greater good. How do you justify favoring Ford Motor Company over local farmers? How do you justify doing something to protect city residents over rural residents?
When I was a little girl, I heard them talking about making a dam, and they were going to flood the valley. That was what they talked about. And I could think of the flood in the Bible. And I really had nightmares about that. And I thought, oh, they can't do that to people.
I think there was a general expectation that this was unstoppable. And I think that was a widespread feeling. This is also why it was relatively easy for the Indian River Company, which was the front end for the power companies, to acquire land.
The Indian River Company consisted of members of private industry, largely power companies, that would see the most benefit from water power that was derived from the creation of the Sacandaga Reservoir. Their main purpose was to pick up properties in the valley prior to Hudson River Regulating District's ability to issue bonds and therefore have money to purchase the properties. One of the major players in the Indian River Company was a man named Elmer J. West. He was the head of Adirondack Power and Light Corporation, and he had major interests in being able to create this dam at Conklinville. If you look at the map of land ownership in 1927 for the area of Conklinville, you'll see almost all of the properties near the proposed dam site are owned either by Elmer J. West or by the Adirondack Power and Light Corporation.
People have been hearing already for 20 years that this reservoir was going to happen.
This project had been talked about for so long and even threatened, but no one took it that seriously. It was like the story of the little boy who cried wolf, and they'd say, yeah, that's never going to happen.
People already stopped investing significantly in their farms. If you look at the inventory of buildings in Sacandaga Park in, say, 1926, the buildings look decrepit. They look neglected. Already for quite some time, these buildings have not gotten any tender love and care. It was a general public understanding that the reservoir was unstoppable.
There were a couple surprises in my research. The first is that the official communication emphasized a stronger than anticipated promotion of the technological benefits and the greater good of the project, with a total disregard for the loss that would be happening to the people whose land was being taken, and there was no empathy expressed. Not surprisingly, or maybe in response to the type of rhetoric that they were hearing, the residents' interpretation of what was happening was focused exclusively on victimization and loss. So the upshot of this is that the two sides telling the story told two very different versions of what was happening. And each side could not relate to the rationale that was being promoted by the other side.
They had to sell the farm. It was really there was an unhappy time for a lot of people. They didn't understand, that was their homestead and they didn't want to move. But they had an auction and it was sold off. Everything either had to be moved or burned. There was no choice. And if people didn't do it, the state would come in and they would take it out and they would burn it. So there was no choice you had. It was not up to you. You just had to do what they said or you were tough out of luck.
I can remember my grandmother crying. And my grandfather said, don't do no darn good to cry because you're going to have to move, you're going to have to move.
All the people, they just hated the water, hated the lake, hated the idea of eminent domain coming in here and telling them where they had to go, and everybody was scurrying around for deeds and their property and making settlements, and no lawyers involved. They just said there's a fair price and land was cheap.
They offered you what was the market price of your house, and many of the places were not in tip-top condition, and they would offer what it was worth market-wise. But you couldn't take that money and buy anything else some other place. And that was one of the sad things.
Then in 29 and 30, when they really began burning buildings and smoke. It was just all over was a layer of smoke all the time. That's what I didn't like. It seemed so destructive and so inhuman, really.
I'm sure there was a lot of heartache when they found out that their homes were going to be destroyed. I can't imagine my home today being destroyed, burnt, telling me I'm going to have to move out. I heard of stories where people stayed right to the last minute and they had to literally pull them out of the house because they were not going to leave.
At that time, I was in high school studying Latin. When this was going on, all I could think of was Romans going through and destroying everything. That's the way it seemed to me.
People that had to relocate due to the project were given the option of being able to move their structure above the taking line. A lot of people took advantage of this and they were able to move their houses.
And they would put the house on skids, oil skids, and they'd bring the timbers out from behind it and put up front as it moved along, and like railroad tie idea.
In all, 22 cemeteries had to be moved in order for this project to go forward. Approximately 3,800 graves were included in these cemeteries. Contrary to what some people believe, this is a well-documented portion of the project. Hudson River has detailed maps of when each cemetery was excavated. One of the things that gets lost in this is how devastating it must have been for parents who had to excavate the remains of their children or sisters or brothers. And records show that family members were allowed to come and watch the excavation process when their loved ones were brought up to the surface and then reinterred in new cemeteries created by Hudson River. Hudson River created new cemeteries where those bodies could be removed to, or the families could choose another cemetery in the area. The records of the cemetery relocation were so intricate that they took photographs of every monument, and on the back side of the photograph they would give a condition report, whether there was a chip in the base of the monument or if some of the writing was illegible. It was really done very well. Some of the headstones were so old that they couldn't read the inscriptions on the gravestones themselves. In that case, the remains were dug up and removed to the new locations, and Hudson River would create a new, small headstone that had a letter and a number on it. And the letter corresponded to which cemetery they came from, and then the number was the number in the plot that was dug up. Native American burial grounds are not marked by traditional European headstones, so it's very difficult to locate them. Hudson River probably was not able to identify these types of burial grounds, and they would probably still be located underneath the lake.
Natural features of Conklinville favored the use of a sluiced core earth dam. Based on soil sampling and material evaluation, it was determined that earth from the mountain located on the south end of the proposed Conklinville Dam site would be suitable material for the construction of the dam. Conklinville Dam is considered a hydraulic fill dam, also known as a sluiced core dam. This type of construction was popular in the early 1900s, particularly in locations where suitable earth material existed, and served to be an effective and economical method of dam construction. Hydraulic fill dams used wash earth material to form a pool of water and fine soil in the middle third of the dam to create an impervious core. The successful construction of hydraulic fill dams, like that built by the Miami Conservancy District in Ohio, in the Great Miami River watershed in 1918, and the Toronto Reservoir Dam built in 1925 in Bethel, New York, likely led to the board's decision to build the Conklinville Dam by a similar method. Trestles carried railway cars which transported earth material from the borrow pits along the length of the dam. Soil was dumped from the railway cars. Once the dikes were constructed to the proper height, a segregation pool was created by pumping water into the space between the dikes. A portion of the material deposited by the railway cars to form the dikes was washed, or sluiced, to the center of the dam. Sluicing was accomplished using barges on which were mounted water pumps, hoses and spray nozzles used to wash the fine soil material from the dikes to the segregation pool. The purpose of sluicing was to separate the fine particles from a portion of the material in the dikes and carry them to the segregation pool, where they would be deposited to form a more tightly compacted, impermeable core.
Aside from the construction of Conklinville Dam, dams also needed to be constructed at the Northville Little Lake as well as Mayfield Lake. These dams guaranteed that those areas would not be swampy when the water levels were lowered later in the season. There were bridges constructed as part of this project. There were two major bridges, the bridge at Northville and the bridge that had to be constructed at Bachelorville, which was nearly 3/4 of a mile long. There were approximately 40 miles of roadway that either needed to be newly constructed or relocated as part of this project. That in itself is an amazing feat.
There was a ceremony. It was not well attended, understandably so, by local residents. Officials did show up from the state, and they did celebrate what had happened, although there were many hearts breaking at the same time.
Then when they cleared all of that land, and it was just a vast sea of nothing, and then the high water came up and never went down, and that was the reservoir.
The dam was closed in March of 1930. By July 7th, the reservoir was allowed to fill to an elevation of 760 feet. The reason for 760 versus the full elevation of 771 was probably as a precautionary measure to not saturate the embankment soil too quickly. One of the major misconceptions is that the reservoir filled much more quickly than anticipated, when actually they predicted fairly accurately how long it would take to fill. The first contract for the construction of the reservoir was let in 1927. The dam was closed in 1930. Overall, the project was completed in a very short time period.
Almost immediately, as the reservoir began to fill, the country found itself in the midst of the Great Depression. Before long, the United States was once again in a conflict that involved virtually every part of the world until 1945.
Stationed at the dam during World War II was the U.S. Army's Aircraft Warning Service. This consisted of civilian volunteers that would watch the skies. They would look for enemy aircraft, and they would record any planes they saw in the sky that may have been a possible threat to the dam or the surrounding area. There are examples of silhouettes of airplanes so that these civilians would know what they were looking at. These air watchmen kept daily records of the kinds of aircrafts they were seeing, what time they were spotted, and they would turn them into the U.S. Army.
Soon after the war ended, the Sacandaga region started to attract vacationers in increasing numbers. A post-war cottage boom had begun to flourish, and the Sacandaga River soon developed into a tourist destination.
My grandfather arranged to have the farmhouse moved up. That was, just prior to the flooding of the lake. At or about the same time, they moved up the schoolhouse. It has been a rental camp of ours since that time, going by the cute name of ABC. This is all commissioned by my grandfather. He was the moving force. I should say that when they flooded the lake, some of our property now was the original family farm. My grandfather had the option to buy some of the surrounding, what is now waterfront, which he did, for which succeeding generations are immensely and eternally grateful.
In 1968, the New York State Legislature changed the name of the reservoir to the Great Sacandaga Lake in an effort to promote tourism.
The fishery of the land of the waving grass, as the area was known to the natives, has evolved over decades and is home to no fewer than 15 species of game fish. After the reservoir filled in 1930, the early years were reported as having good fishing. However, it was the cool, hazy fall morning of September 15, 1940, which thrust the fishery of the Sacandaga Reservoir into the history books. This was the day that Peter Dubuque had been trolling for pike just outside Benedict Bay when a fish smashed his lure. This northern pike, which took an hour to land, weighed in at 46 pounds, 2 ounces, and measured 52.5 inches long. It became the largest pike ever taken by hook and line in the world, a record that stood until 1976. A historical roadside marker was dedicated by the Great Sacandaga Lake Fisheries Federation in September 2015, which marked the 75th anniversary of the catch. Many volunteers have helped stock the lake over the years. Fishing contests are held seasonally by the Federation, which along with other public and private sources are the catalyst for funding stocking of the lake. An enhancement fund administered by the Great Sacandaga Lake Advisory Council has been set up providing annual funding for fish stocking and other beneficial programs around the lake.
It is important to get the youth involved and interested in the history and ecology of the lake. We accomplish this by bringing specialists into local school districts. They teach the students about the species of fish found in Sacandaga Lake and what they need to survive. And then we actually bring the kids out and have them participate in our fish stocking program, which is very exciting to the kids.
All right, go ahead, babe. Don't drop the bucket in.
Though the valley was once home to villages, hamlets, mills, and farms, there's been contention and legend about what lies beneath, to which only one answer holds true. As part of a mandated cleanup before the valley could fill, specifications clearly stated that everything was to be cleared. Structures, trees, fences, and signs, not even hitching posts, would stand a chance.
I've been diving the Sacandaga now for about 12 years. We usually go up to Conklinville and use that as a area to learn how to use our equipment and how to swim. Today we dove on the Day Center Bridge. Was our first dive. We dropped down into darkness and started looking. We found a steel iron truss bridge. And we followed it along to see where its course was and the piers and things like that. When we found it in the upright position and took video of it, we could actually see the guardrails, so to speak, on the sides of the bridge. Second dive we did was up at Conklinville, which they moved the bridge off of the piers into the river bottom. They didn't blow them up, as you can witness. You'll see the top of the piers in the video, that they just cut the bolts and then just pushed it off with some kind of excavator or something.
Aside from the two bridges, Day Center and Conklinville, about the only other thing we've seen is empty foundations that had the buildings on, but they burned the buildings down and they just left the foundations as they were. The streets, you can see tree stumps where the trees used to line the streets, but all you see is the roads and foundations. There's no churches down there, church steeples, no structures, no signs, just empty, desolate area where a village once stood.
My mom, Agnes Gilbert, started the Ring of Fire. We put the flyers out when we went around the whole lake and dropped off flyers in all the stores, bars, or whatever place we could find a place to put a flyer. And the first year, it was quite successful, and it has grown every year since then. That was in 1988 we started.
All things considered, the reservoir has functioned exactly as it was designed and intended to for nearly a century. Considering the resources and tools of the time, it was a magnificent example of engineering.
My conclusion was that they did really a super good job. And it's actually done a very good job over time for the greater community.
The quality of the work for the type of equipment that they had was really quite extraordinary. And when you think the whole project, the building of the dam, the building of all the roads and the bridges, the removal of the cemeteries, the purchase of all the land, all that was done for $12 million. It's extraordinary, I think.
It was an amazing accomplishment, actually.
And now you have this beautiful lake that attracts people and creates something in the way of a new industry that was really never intended, and something that's really quite special, I think.
When reflecting on the personal and professional challenges experienced in the Sacandaga Valley over a century ago, what is irrefutable is the extent of engineering and construction that went into the creation of the Great Sacandaga Lake. Today, it provides jobs and a way of life for a new generation of families. Although we sometimes wish that time would stand still, the Great Sacandaga is a wonderful example of how time marches on. People change and life evolves. The beauty of the Great Sacandaga is evident everywhere you look. The culture of those who live along its shores is not so different than those who came before them. What they have in common is an appreciation for their neighborhoods, their schools and churches, and their way of life. This film is dedicated to those who sacrificed their homes, farms, and livelihoods, all for the greater good, as well as to those who engineered one of the most magnificent reservoirs of the time with foresight, dedication, and ingenuity. And it's also dedicated to the people of the lake as it exists today, for their role of vigilance in the protection and management of this glimmering treasure. And finally, to those who dreamed of harnessing nature and building the Great Sacandaga.